So everybody, we are back today, and we're doing kind of a bounce off of our drive back from Philly commission conversation that Brett and I had. So today we're going to do a little bit of a dive into what does it look like when you have a CBC, which is cooperating broker compensation, and a paragraph 3 filled out in the standard agreement of sale for Pennsylvania. So we're only talking Pennsylvania forms. So Brett, how are you today?
Doing good, Nick. How are you?
Good. I'm still waiting for the new office to come through, so I'm kind of still homeless with the podcast studio right now and doing it out of the real estate office today, but we're going to make it work.
I'm glad you're not under one of the encampments downtown. Although that would be an interesting location for a podcast.
It would.
Could be an interesting topic too, right?
It really would. I think that, that's something that is a growing issue in this area that really needs to be addressed.
Right. Different topic for a different day, though.
Right. So, Brett, we've been doing this now for almost a year.
Mm-hmm.
We are well over 6 months in, and we're still seeing people not understanding the difference between the CBC and paragraph 3, putting it together, doing it separately. What does it mean? How does it mean? Why does it mean? So let's just start off with the CBC in a old transaction. What did it mean?
Well, prior 2023, my understanding is, so the CBC, Cooperating Broker Compensation Agreement, was not widely used throughout Pennsylvania because at that time you had offers of compensation, unilateral offers of compensation in the MLS, and most agents, buyer's agents, were willing to accept the fee that was offered by the listing broker in the MLS. And because it was an offer of compensation through the MLS, it was in writing, it was unilateral, meaning it was open to anybody, and to accept the offer, you had to present a ready, willing, and able buyer, terms acceptable to the seller, and you got paid the fee. I do understand, though, that in the southeast part of Pennsylvania, they did use the CBC to confirm what was being offered in the MLS. So if you offered as a listing agent, you offered X percent as compensation to a buyer's broker when when you got the offer, the written offer from the buyer, or, shortly thereafter when you were finishing up the negotiations and getting the last signatures, you would also get the CBC from the buyer's agent identifying that X percent was being paid to you or your broker as the buyer's broker, kind of a belts and suspenders type of thing. It would also be used if it could be used, I guess, if you were working with an unrepresented seller of FSBO, and they were offering to pay you outside of the agreement of sale, or if you were dealing with an off-market listing, an off-MLS listing that was outside of your brokerage, or if you were working with a real estate agent who was not a member of the MLS and you were cooperating, where the listing broker was willing to pay the buyer's broker a fee, you would use the CBC. Or if it was a situation where, like let's say you were offering, X percent, and I'm the buyer's agent, and I'd call you up and say, hey, look, Nick, I got a buyer. They're really interested in doing this. They're willing to pay a little bit more for this, but they need help. They need a little bit extra help. Would you be willing, in addition, to pay, instead of the X percent, would you be able to pay X plus 0.5? And if you said yes, then we would use the CBC to confirm that additional compensation was agreed upon by us prior to entering into the negotiations or anything of that nature. So a lot of different ways it could have been used. but they were all dependent upon and tied to broker compensation. That was the historic use or uses of the CBC.
So nowadays, what we are seeing are options. We're seeing people going, hey, look, the seller's willing to pay. What that is, put it in your agreement. We're seeing people saying, oh, the standard, hey, I'm offering X in a cooperating compensation. And in that case, then what's happening is people are sending out the CBC. Some agents are actually being super proactive. And when you schedule your showing, there's an agent here in my office. When you schedule the showing, as soon as it's confirmed, you get an email within a couple of hours with a signed CBC from the listing agent of this is what's being offered. So there's that. There's all kinds of, some people are leaving them on the kitchen counter in the house. So there's different things that are being done right now to notify buyer agents of what, if any, compensation is being offered up front. So
Let me put a caveat on there. Compensation that's being offered by the listing broker. Agent. Right.
Yep.
Which is key, which is critical.
So what I think the misunderstanding is coming is they sign that CBC, and it's not every agent, but there's a vast majority. And then on page 2 of the standard agreement of sale, they're also adding it in there as commission. And there's some key words to that phrase that I think people are missing or not reading. And that is in addition to. So Brett, what happens when I have a CBC signed at X and I put on my agreement of sale that I also, that Y needs to be paid?
Then at closing, you get X plus Y.
Correct.
Which is a problem, or potentially a problem for you, depending on what your buyer agency contract says. Because if your buyer agency contract is Y and you're getting X plus Y, or your buyer agency contract is X and you're getting X plus Y, you're getting compensation that exceeds the amount agreed to in the agency contract, which violates the settlement and the rules of the MLS.
Yes. And what does it do for the listing agent and or seller?
It serves as a very, very good tool for education.
So
we
you
can
guys
break
heard
that
our
down.
Stories. You heard stories at the last legal podcast of some things that have happened, and this was one of those stories where an agent had X in the CBC and they had X in the agreement of sale. It was the exact same number. And at closing, that agent got X squared because it was both. It was addition to. So when you're looking...
And as I recall, the listing agent ended up getting 0.
Goose egg.
Correct, which means the seller had 0 impact on the seller.
Which was the right thing to do.
The listing agent learned a valuable lesson that they will never duplicate. The question I have is, did the agent actually learn? Or do they understand what the lesson is?
Or are they being spiteful and mad because of what happened and blaming everybody else?
Yeah, maybe. But let me kind of explain what I mean by that. Did they really learn the lesson? So when I say learn the lesson, did they actually learn, by getting 0, do they now actually understand the interplay between the CBC and the agreement of sale? And the best way that I've found to explain that, or to figure out if someone has an understanding, is ask them to explain it to me. And if we have to do it through an example, we'll do it through the example, because that will tell me within a couple of minutes if you actually understand how these two forms do and do not work together. I am very aware of agents out there that have a very, very sharp understanding of how they work together, and have an equally sharp understanding that listing agents do not understand how they work together and have used it to their advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like the situation that you described wasn't necessarily the buyer's agent using the listing agent's lack of understanding to their advantage. It was sort of a consequence
Mm-hmm.
of what they did. But there are agents out there that understand. So, for example, just to start at the top and then we'll go backwards. Start at the top. If I'm a buyer's agent and my buyer agency, a contract is for X squared, and I ask you, you tell me you're giving me X as broker to broker compensation, and you and I sign a CBC where you're giving me X, and then I put X in paragraph 3A of the agreement of sale, and you as the listing agent meet with your seller and sign that offer, you have just agreed to give me X squared or 2X. I mean, either way you want to look at it, it's the same dollar amount. Mm-hmm. I've knowingly done that, and I have a buyer agency contract that allows me to collect that full fee, and you end up with a heck of a lot less than you expected. Correct. As the listing agent.
I think personally, and this is just my thoughts, and I know not everybody will agree with it, but I've always been in the mindset from the very beginning, even before any of this came about, whatever my buyer and I agreed to is between me and my buyer. Now, if the seller is willing to pay some of it, great. Good for the buyer. It's less money out of their pocket. But the buyer has always been charged the difference because it is what them and I have agreed to. It's the services and the level of services that they are getting from me that they have agreed to and to have paid for. So I've always been in the mindset of my compensation conversations have always been, between the buyer and between the seller. And I fell into the old way of doing it to where when you do that listing contract, you find out how much they want to give to the buyer agent at that point in time. But now with all of these changes, I've actually watched my sellers save money because what I would have negotiated for a buyer's agent would have been greater than what they're even negotiating for themselves. So now they're saving money by me not doing that negotiation.
Yeah, imagine that. You've just given the seller the power and authority over the ability to sell their house. Who'd have thought? I mean, that's kind of the way it's supposed to be, right? I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek with that. And I think a couple of things that you said are very important and very accurate, but if people are just kind of half listening or are not necessarily as in tune with the practice of real estate because they don't do it or they're new to it or different marketplace, whatever the case might be. I think it bears repeating. Number one, very importantly, your conversations with your buyer to negotiate your fee stand independently of any compensation coming from the seller's side of the transaction. So, I'm going to ask you the question, Nick, when your seller agrees to pay you your fee, whatever that might be, do you care anymore what, if any, compensation is being offered by the seller side of the deal?
No, I don't.
No, because you're getting paid by your buyer, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to work like hell to get some or all of your fee paid by the seller's side of the transaction. Working on your buyer's behalf, trying to do that. And it's probably the conversation you've had with the buyer, and you probably have an understanding from your buyer where their pain point is. Nick, I'll pay you this amount, but boy, if you can get me, a third of your fee or a half your fee or 3/4 of your fee paid by the seller side of the deal, then, I'm going to be, very, very, very pleased with you because, that is going to allow me more flexibility to do other things with respect to purchasing the property. And then you go do your job, right? You go out there and negotiate hard. I think, the other thing that you said, and I know you've said it because this is how you practice, so it's really becoming, it's really become ingrained in your vocabulary, is talking about the seller paying the fee. and the distinction being the seller versus the listing agent.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about this a number of different times on this podcast and in other venues and other circumstances. But I see the industry moving, not just nationwide, but also within Pennsylvania, away from the broker to broker compensation aspect. With that model, if you will. I just see more and more agents and more consumers, buyers and sellers, understanding the value of negotiating the fee that they're paying to their agent, their broker, independently of the transaction. And then seeking, as a buyer, seeking some offset from the seller
Mm-hmm.
as a term of the offer, because, as you do this, for a living on a regular basis and do it very well. You can structure a deal in so many different ways to benefit a buyer in ways that don't adversely affect the seller's bottom line.
Correct.
And when you are a buyer's agent negotiating on behalf of your buyer with the seller, then the consumers, the buyer and the seller, have control over how that works and how that flows. I mean, that to me is the, if as a realtor, as a real estate licensee and a realtor, if your guiding principle, if your North Star, if you will, is your client, your consumer, your customer, then giving them the maximum amount of power in the transaction, the maximum amount of transparency, how do you criticize that?
Correct.
With keeping the consumer at the fore? I don't know how you can.
Correct.
And I think it's also, it's important to understand for any of the other real estate agents that do follow and listen to the podcast, if you are not participating in broker to broker compensation, meaning as a listing agent, you're not offering it,
Mm-hmm.
or as a buyer's agent, you won't accept it. There are some brokerages out there that have said our business model is we will not accept payment from a listing broker. We do not participate in broker to broker compensation. If you're in either of those transactions, either, I don't offer it as a listing broker, and if I remember correctly, that's the model that you follow. You do not offer compensation as a listing agent. So you're
Correct.
currently, yeah, okay. Want to make sure that I understood that correctly. Then you will not have a CBC.
Correct.
If there's no broker to broker compensation in the transaction, there should not be a CBC.
Correct.
So what happens, when we have broker to broker, when we don't, when we have a CBC and paragraph 3A is being used. And I think it's important. This is an area this is a dynamic that agents in Pennsylvania are still very confused about. And that level of confusion exists in other states that have forms that work similar to what Pennsylvania's do. And there are other states out there that have similar structures and similar dynamics. I'm not going to talk about them because I don't understand them well enough to do so, but I don't want people to think that I'm picking on Pennsylvania agents. This interplay between a broker to broker fee agreement and fee negotiated to be paid by the seller is confusing to agents throughout the United States where this model exists. And I think and I've had conversations recently with agents and brokers that are talking about, seller concessions as being compensation. Mm-hmm. And then they talk about paragraph 3A. And recently in text messages is an absolute great way to have a conversation and not understand what the hell's going on. And I had this conversation, I was having this conversation with a broker. And, the first thing they talk about is the broker's paying the fee. And then they talk about, well, no, we use paragraph 3A. I'm like, well, then you're not doing broker to broker compensation. And then they're talking, well, yeah, it's being paid by concessions. I'm like, wait a minute. What are you talking about? I'm confused. Or are you doing all of the above? no, we're not. This is what we're, and I'm thinking we need to sit down and have a conversation so
Right.
that I can understand exactly what you're doing, and I can help you. And they were a little put off by this. I'm like, I need to help you get your words right, and they were a little offended by it. I'm like, you're talking to me like I'm a 5-year-old. Well, sort of, I am, but I don't want you to be offended by it. But I need you to understand that the words matter.
They do.
And 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 when you're talking about concession compensation and CBC, you're talking about three different avenues of money flow.
Correct.
And if you want me as your lawyer to tell you how to handle something, you need to know what you're talking about because my answers
Correct.
could be dependent upon that. So, and I think, and this is, I've been critical of the paragraph 3, how it's structured, paragraph 3 in the agreement of sale. But I want to be clear. It's the phraseology that I've been critical of, not the intent, not how it's designed to work. I think the way that it's set up in paragraph 3A and 3B is an excellent model for the standard agreement of sale. I think that embodies the idea of empowering the buyer and the seller to have control and the transparency. I think that structure is excellent. And I think it's consistent with what a lot of other business models are following. And so I do support that. I think where a lot of the confusion lies is in the phraseology, right? The words, because what you said, right? Words matter. And the first thing to understand is paragraph 3 doesn't just talk about concessions; it talks about compensation and concessions.
Correct.
And
And they're two
and that
different lines for a reason.
they're two different lines for a reason. And specifically with what we're talking about, interplaying with the CBC, it really is important to understand that 3A is compensation because the CBC is also addressing compensation. And I understand when realtors read paragraph 3A, in addition to any cooperating broker compensation negotiated between the broker using the PAR form CBC or some other agreement, seller agrees to pay. What they're reading there is we've got to have both. They're reading it that says that we need to have, in addition to what's in paragraph 3A, we need to have the CBC to document it. That's not what's meant.
Correct.
That's not what was meant when it was drafted. And I've talked to some people that understand the form, and they can't fathom how people are misreading it. And I'm like, well, let me,
Well, are
pull
they misreading it or not reading it at all?
both. I think it's both. Because
Okay.
I've sat down with people and I say, read the words to me, and they read them. And I said, what does that mean to you? And they tell me what I just said. That means that what we have on the CBC goes in here. So they are misunderstanding it. And I get it. It comes down from the in addition to any cooperating broker compensation agreement. Well, okay. If you don't understand, and I don't, I'm not going to fault I'm running out of time, or I'm not going to fault the industry. But there wasn't, there were, the agents for the last 25 years weren't taught the difference, right, on how compensation can be structured, because everything, not everything, probably 98% of the residential deals in Pennsylvania were done within the MLS. Maybe that number is a little bit high, but it's a very, very high number. And so many agents in the residential world never had to deal with structuring compensation outside of what was in the MLS.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, there were many agents who practiced without ever having buyer agency contracts signed, and operating just on the fact that the offer of compensation was through the MLS.
Which
So
is mind-boggling to me.
yeah, but to me, it's just like calling it, it's just like calling, today Thursday. It just is, right? Because that's what I saw for so many years. So I understand why a year ago, 8 months ago, there was a disconnect in this, because so many agents didn't see the model in the way that it's structured now. They didn't understand it. They'd never experienced it. And so there was a learning curve. But I haven't, that learning curve isn't flattening out as much as it needs to, as much as I thought it would. So I think the important thing to understand is if you are a listing broker not offering compensation, you never need a CBC. If you are a buyer's agent who is not getting compensated by a listing broker, either because it's not available in the transaction or your business model is not to accept it, you never need a CBC. If 100% of the compensation being paid to the buyer's agent by the seller's side of the deal comes from the seller, in other words, if the seller is the only one, not the listing broker, the seller is the one that's paying the buyer's agent on behalf of the buyer some of their fee, you don't need a CBC. If you do add a CBC to the mix, that will be in addition to what your seller pays.
Correct. That means some of it's coming from the listing brokerage and some of it's coming from the seller. Now, if you as a listing agent screwed up and did not explain that to your seller, that might mean that all of it is coming from you.
Or I've seen situations where it comes from both the seller and the listing broker, much to the seller's aggravation.
Yeah.
Because if the seller, if the listing agent doesn't understand the forms and how they work together, what they've explained to the seller is not going to be what happens at closing.
Correct.
And the title company is going to take the position that, look, I don't care what you thought it said. I'm going by what the document says. And unless you guys come to an agreement and say it's something different, I'm following the contract that you gave me. And if you don't like what it says, that's a whole lot of a you problem and not a whole lot of a me problem.
Correct.
Because it's your contract. I didn't write it.
Stop lead providers from auctioning off the buyer leads generated from your listings. Meet InstaShow Plus, a premier showing management system built to generate, qualify, and convert buyer leads for you. Agents receive verified leads and you never meet unqualified or unidentified prospects. Take control of your leads and your safety today. Learn more by emailing us at hello@instashowplus.com. That's hello@instashowplus.com. Or call us at 877-877-8030.
Transform your product with DB360 Soft Washing. Say goodbye to dirt, grime, and stains with DB360 Soft Washing, the experts in safe, effective, and exterior cleaning. We specialize in soft washing, roofing, siding, driveways, walkways, decks, fences, commercial and residential, eco-friendly solutions, and insured. Call us today at 717-691-1712 or visit us at db360wash.com. DB360 Soft Washing, clean you can trust.
Need a handyman? Call the Handyman Guy, LLC. For small fixes to major projects, call the Handyman LLC, deliver professional, reliable, affordable services. Our experiences: repairs, painting, plumbing, electrical, carpentry, furniture assembly, and much, much more. Licensed, insured, and definitely quality guaranteed. Call our number, 717-819-5453. Visit us at thathandymanguy.com. The Handyman Guy LLC, your trusted home fix expert. Thank you. Have a great day.
Now let's look at faults.
Mm-hmm.
So in a situation to where a listing agent does not explain that correctly to their buyer or to their seller, and we get to settlement date and the seller goes, wait a second, this isn't how much I'm supposed to be paying.
Mm-hmm.
Who, if anybody, has the right to terminate?
Nobody. I mean, that doesn't, if I didn't understand as the seller my contractual obligations, we'll start with that's my problem. In the relationship between me, the seller, and you, the buyer, if I didn't understand my financial obligations, that's my fault. That's my responsibility. I take fault out of that. It's my responsibility as a seller to understand what my obligations are under the contract to you, the buyer. Okay, so let's break this down, because when we're at settlement, the only thing that matters, really, at least from a title agent's perspective, from a very generic level, is what does the agreement of sale say?
Uh-huh.
Because as a title agent, I'm responsible for making sure that the money flows consistently with the written contract.
Uh-huh.
And if the written contract says that the seller is paying X percent, then I'm going to show, coming from the seller side of the transaction, to the buyer's broker on behalf of the buyer. So I'm going to have a debit on the seller side that says X percent payable to buyer's broker. And on the buyer's side of the transaction, I'm going to have a credit that's going to show X percent coming from seller. So I'm going to show that there. And that's going to, because that's what the contract says.
Uh-huh.
Now, yes, can the parties modify the contract? Buyer and seller can modify the contract. They can always do that. Great. It's going to slow down things, can be done. But you're not talking about that situation. You're talking about when the buyer says, look, I fully expected you to pay X percent to my agent. You agreed to pay X percent to my agent. I'm not modifying the contract. And so the seller has to pay X percent to the agent. If I also throw in paragraph 3B, a concession, as the title company, I'm giving a concession. And that shows, when I do it, that shows differently, right? So if I'm getting 3A, X percent, I'm showing that as a debit payable to buyer's broker on seller's side, and a credit under the broker boxes, under the 700 boxes, payable from the seller, or maybe it's in 1300, doesn't matter. It's payable, and it's going to show a credit from the seller to buyer's broker. Not to the buyer, to the buyer's broker. It's going to show a payment directly to the broker.
Oh, I thought we were on the concessions.
No.
Oh.
Starting with the broker. On the concession, I'm going to show, if the concession is 2%, I'm going to show 2% debit, seller concession, on the seller side. So if the seller's paying X percent to the buyer's agent and 2% to the buyer, then there's going to be two debits on the seller's side.
And
X
separate
percent
lines.
On separate lines. X percent payable to buyer's broker and 2% credited to buyer, from seller to buyer. On the buyer's transaction, it's going to show a credit of X percent from seller to buyer's broker and a credit of 2% from seller to buyer. Separate lines, separate payees, because that X percent is going to the buyer's broker and the 2% concession is going to the buyer directly. Now, the seller may not be happy with that, because if the seller did not understand that, then it's because of how the contract was written between seller and listing broker, how it was explained between seller and listing broker. I mean, so it's important to understand, and this is the text conversation I had with the broker demonstrating. Very smart broker, very experienced, runs a really good ship, does a great job, but conflating brokers paying the fee, sellers paying the fee, when you start mixing those words, well, yeah, you know what I mean. Like, don't, it really matters who's paying it, because at closing, it's a title company. I want to stand up and say, hang on a second. I don't care about y'all having a fight, seller and listing broker, about what they actually owe you. Okay. I need to make sure, and you've seen the settlement sheet. So, you've seen it before we got to closing. You see what you're getting. And we're not, unless the contract's redone, and if there's a lender involved, that may create a different problem. We're not modifying.
The thing I want people to understand, though, is, and the reason that the lines have to be separate, is lending has limitations as to what a buyer can get in concessions. And
they do.
You have to use that word, because that is what it is. It's concessions to the buyer to help them pay their closing cost. And there's a limit.
There is a limit, but the compensation
is outside of it.
It doesn't affect it necessarily.
Correct. And that's
At
why they're
least not in
two separate
Pennsylvania.
lines.
Correct. Right. Because, Fannie published a letter in April of last year that said if you're in a market where it's normal practice for the seller to pay some or all of the buyer broker's fee, you're not considered an interested party contributor, and therefore any concessions paid by seller, any compensation paid by seller to buyer's broker on behalf of buyer does not count against any available concessions that the buyer can receive from the seller. So it is entirely possible, and I've seen it happen regularly in the last 8 months, where a buyer is getting both. Both 3A and 3B are completed, and the buyer is getting both 3A and 3B, both compensation paid by seller and a concession from the seller. And 98% of the time, the seller's aware. That's not the issue. The issue most of the time comes from the listing agent when they've duplicated it with a CBC.
Mm-hmm.
And now that they've agreed to pay to match what the seller paid. And that's all well and good. Like I said, it's a great education. If the buyer's agent, the buyer broker cannot accept anything that exceeds the amount of compensation they negotiated with their buyer. So if if I've negotiated X percent with my buyer and the seller is paying me Y, let's say Y is 1/2 of X. Okay. So the seller's paying me Y. That means the buyer is also paying me Y on the buyer side. But if the listing broker, in addition to they used the CBC and offered me Y, and the seller offers me Y, and Y plus Y equals X, hell yeah, I'm going to sign that CBC because I just saved my buyer 100% of the cost of my fee.
As long as it's in your buyer agency and you can do that.
And that's right. That's right. As long as I'm allowed to accept compensation from the listing broker. Now, if I'm in a brokerage that doesn't accept it, I can't take it. Or if I get the seller, my fee is X, and I get the seller to offer me X, and the listing broker does a CBC where they're willing to pay me X, can't take it because it violates the settlement. It violates the terms of my buyer agency contract when I capped myself at X.
Yeah.
But that is, but I've seen it happen. We talked about it last week, but I've seen it happen, and I've talked to other agents, brokers, lawyers that have encountered it, and it doesn't happen as often as it could because buyers, brokers, buyers office managers are catching the duplication and asking about it. And they're saying to the listing broker, hey, did you mean to do this? Or
Which is sad that it's the buyer's agents calling this out.
It is in part because we can't take this.
Yeah.
It's too much. We can't exceed this. Well, no, we never meant to do that. That's not what we did.
Yeah, that's what you did.
Yeah. And I'm aware of at least one situation where the office manager called the listing broker and they argued about it. And finally, the listing broker realized that the office manager was right and they corrected it. And the buyer's agent was pissed.
Mm-hmm.
And their answer was, I know what they were doing. I know the listing agent was an idiot. I wanted them to pay my full commission. I knew they got it wrong. I planned on them getting it wrong. And they did get it wrong. And now you owe me, you office, you broker owe me this. You refund it to the buyer because we had them doing it, but you stepped in. And
without checking or verifying.
Without checking or verifying and really, and the stones of the agent. You breached your fiduciary duty to your buyer.
Mm-hmm.
And broker called me and said, what do I do? I'm like, well, your agent's right. First of all, make sure your agents understand what they're doing. Number one. Number two, check if there's a mistake. But number three, in this case, your agent was spot on. You gave back money that rightfully belongs to the buyer. And my recommendation is you make the buyer whole. And people say, well, that's not right. Agents shouldn't be allowed to do this. Hang on a second. Agents have been doing this
for
in different
years.
capacities for years. I mean, look, do you know why PAR has a form that's letters are TERAREL, the TERAREL? It's a termination and release on one document, because an agent within the inspection contingency to terminate, this was years ago, sent a release to get the deposit money returned to their buyer. And the listing broker didn't do anything. It was 2 days before the contingency period expired. They sent the release. And 3 days after the contingency period expired, the buyer's agent called and said, where's the deposit money? You owe it to us. And the listing agent said, you never terminated the agreement. We don't owe it to you. Contingency period's passed, and we're not giving you the deposit money back. Then what happened? The buyer broker reimbursed the buyer their deposit amount, and the buyer's agent learned a lesson. It's not the only example I have, but it's the same type of thing. So if someone says, well, that's not right, and agents shouldn't be allowed to do it, agents have been doing that kind of thing forever. You've got an agent that's smart and understands the tools of their trade.
They're going to do it.
And they're using them. I don't have a problem with that. They're not misrepresenting anything. It's a different thing if you're hiding something, if you're prevaricating, if you're misrepresenting something. But silence isn't, if I don't have a duty to speak, my failure to educate you on your mistake is not unethical or unlawful.
Yeah.
You've got to do your job. I don't have to do your job. I mean, if I correct it for you, tell you what, I'll correct you. Yeah, Nick, you made a big mistake. Pay me half your commission. I'll correct it for you. Save you half your commission. So again, I'm not advocating that anybody do anything sneaky or underhanded at all. But if you're doing it up front and the person on the other side doesn't understand their job, doesn't understand their tools, doesn't understand the transaction,
that's their fault.
That's their fault, and that goes back to who's responsible for them and training them and teaching them.
Yeah.
That there's only so much you can do, and some people don't have the capacity to learn.
Yeah.
That's just, again, with what I do, for 25 years, I've been working with people, not just realtors, but with clients, and I have repeat clients, and some of them just, not that they're not intellectually capable of it, they just are too prideful or too stubborn. I've been doing this for 25 years and I'm not changing. Okay, I'll keep defending you and we'll keep losing. So that is what it is.
Well, guys, as you guys can see, this conversation is very, very deep. We probably haven't even scratched the surface, because today's conversation has brought up 2 more topics that can be discussed about it. So we have so much more coming at you this season. Super excited. Brett is in direct contact with the National Association about some of the changes, so that we have some good, fresh content for you on it. This is definitely a season you want to tune into. And as always, Brett, thank you so much for hanging out with me today and sharing your insight and thoughts, and look forward to more.
Absolutely, Nick. Have a great day.